And when the courtroom finally emptied and the noise faded, one truth remained quietly standing. Sometimes the miracle isn't thunder from the sky or a voice from the clouds. Sometimes it's truth arriving exactly on time, the kind of truth that God plants deep inside someone the world has already judged, and waits patiently for the moment it must be revealed. People laughed at appearances. God watched the heart. They saw an orange jumpsuit. God saw preparation. They heard silence. God knew a voice was coming. In our daily lives, we do the same thing more often than we admit. We judge too fast. We overlook the quiet ones. We mistake struggle for weakness. But time and again, God reminds us what looks small can carry great purpose. The miracle isn't always escape. Sometimes it's endurance, wisdom, and courage growing in the dark until the light is ready. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who's been underestimated. Drop a comment and tell us where you were watching from, and maybe who you are praying for today. And if you believe that justice, hope, and second chances still matter, subscribe to this channel so we can keep telling stories that lift the forgotten. May God bless you, protect your family, and give you strength in the moments when the world doubts you. And may you remember this: what God places inside you cannot be erased by laughter, labels, or fear. Christmas Eve arrived quietly, the way grief often does. It did not knock. It did not announce itself with bells or laughter. It simply settled into the room, heavy and unavoidable. Sarah Coleman sat on the edge of a narrow hotel bed, staring at the ring on her finger. The gold band caught the weak yellow light from the bedside lamp, flashing softly each time she turned it. She spun it once, then again, slowly, as if giving it time to protest. It didn't. With a sigh that felt older than her years, she slid the ring off and placed it on the chipped wooden table beside the bed. It landed with a sound far too small for something that had once carried 7 years of promises. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and industrial cleaner. The wallpaper peeled at the corners like tired skin. A heater rattled in the background, working hard but accomplishing little, just like her heart at the moment. This was where Sarah had spent the last week. Not home, not quite homeless, just nowhere. Her suitcase lay open on the floor, clothes thrown inside without care. It was the packing of someone who didn't know where she was going, only that she could not stay. Her phone vibrated again. She didn't need to look to know who it was. David's mother, again. The 10th call in 2 hours. Sarah turned the phone face down and let it vibrate itself into silence. She didn't have the strength to hear concern disguised as disappointment, or questions sharpened like knives. 3 hours earlier, David had spoken the words that were still echoing inside her skull. "I can't marry someone who can't give me children, Sarah." He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even sounded cruel. That somehow made it worse. She could still see herself standing in the doorway of the apartment that had once been theirs, keys in one hand, a bag in the other, frozen as if the world had suddenly forgotten how to move. He hadn't looked at her. He had simply taken the keys from her palm, stepped back inside, and closed the door. 7 years ended with the soft click of a lock. 2 months ago, the doctor had been clear. No gentle metaphors, no false hope. Uterine complications, irreversible. Pregnancy would never happen. When she told David that night, he had held her hand. He had said it was okay, that they would figure it out, that love was bigger than biology, that adoption was always an option. Sarah had believed him. Belief, she would later learn, is often borrowed time. It took him 8 weeks to decide she was no longer enough. His mother started making comments soon after, casual remarks dressed as jokes, questions about grandchildren that weren't really questions at all. By Christmas Eve, it was over. Now, Sarah was alone in a cheap hotel room, listening to a heater fight a losing battle against the cold, wondering how a life could collapse so quietly. She stood, pulled on her thin coat, and grabbed her purse. There was no point staying inside anymore. The room felt too small for her thoughts. She paid the bill with the last credit card that hadn't been declined yet and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a slap. Manhattan in December was merciless. The kind of cold that didn't just chill your skin. It crawled into your bones and whispered that you were fragile. Sarah pulled her coat tighter, but it did nothing. The streets were alive. Families walked hand in hand beneath glowing decorations. Couples laughed, stopping to take photos in front of shop windows dressed in red and gold. A choir sang outside a church, their voices rising like prayers into the frozen air. The smell of hot chocolate and roasted chestnuts drifted between strangers. Christmas lights wrapped around lampposts like constellations brought down to earth. Everyone had somewhere to go. Everyone had someone waiting. Everyone except her. Sarah walked without direction, her boots tapping against the pavement in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Slow, tired, determined to keep moving, simply because stopping felt dangerous. She passed crowded restaurants and closing shops. She passed joy she did not belong to. After nearly an hour, her legs ached and her breath came out in shallow clouds. She found herself in Central Park, standing near a massive Christmas tree glowing with soft golden lights. A family posed for photos beneath it. A couple kissed nearby. Children ran in circles, screaming with joy, their laughter sharp and bright against the night. Sarah sat down on a cold park bench. And there, surrounded by celebration, she finally disappeared. She lowered her head into her hands and let the tears fall. She tried to cry quietly, to be polite about it, to keep her pain small and invisible. But grief does not always listen. A sob escaped her chest, sudden and broken. No one noticed. No one looked, until a thin, clear voice cut through the noise like a bell. "Daddy, why is she all alone on Christmas?" Sarah looked up, startled, wiping her face with the sleeve of her coat. A little girl stood in front of her, no more than 6 or 7. Blonde hair peeked out from beneath a red knit beanie topped with a white pom-pom. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her blue eyes wide with innocent concern. Beside her stood a man holding the hands of 3 other girls, all blonde, all bright-eyed. 2 of them were tiny twins bundled in matching scarves. The third, slightly older, tilted her head as she studied Sarah with quiet curiosity. The man himself was tall, broad-shouldered, his posture straight even at rest. He wore a dark coat, practical and well-worn, the kind chosen for warmth rather than fashion. His face was tired. Deep shadows rested beneath his eyes, the kind that sleep alone could not erase. But his eyes were kind. "Sophie," he said gently, his voice low and steady, "don't bother the lady." "But Daddy," the girl insisted softly, "she's crying." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to." The man hesitated. He looked at his daughters, then back at Sarah. Something passed over his face, calculation, concern, and a quiet decision forming beneath the surface. He released the girl's hands and stepped closer. "Are you okay?" he asked. The question was simple, honest, dangerous. Sarah let out a small, bitter laugh. "I'm great," she said. "Couldn't be better. Merry Christmas, right?" He didn't smile. He just studied her, as if he understood that sarcasm was armor. After a moment, he asked, "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Sarah shook her head. "No." The twins tugged at the hem of his coat. "Daddy," one whispered, "it's cold." "And she doesn't have a warm coat," the other added solemnly. The man inhaled slowly. In that breath lived years of discipline, of responsibility, of decisions made under pressure. Sarah would later realize that this was the moment everything shifted. But for now, all she saw was a stranger in the cold, looking at her as if she mattered. And for the first time that night, the darkness loosened its grip, just a little. Some were shouted over the roar of helicopters. Some were made in the dark, knee-deep in water, heart hammering like a war drum. Some had been written into reports afterward, stripped of emotion and reduced to bullet points. This one happened on a park bench. No alarms, no orders, no mission briefing, just a woman crying quietly on Christmas Eve. Matthew stood there longer than he should have. He was aware of it in the same distant way he was aware of cold seeping through his boots or the weight of the past pressing against his chest. His daughters waited beside him, 4 small anchors tugging at the edges of his attention. They were watching him, not with fear, not with impatience, with expectation. That was new. Sophie, the oldest, held his hand tighter than usual. She had inherited her mother's awareness, the ability to notice things others missed. Zoe leaned forward slightly, curiosity warring with caution. The twins stood shoulder to shoulder, silent but alert, as if they understood that something important was unfolding, even if they couldn't name it. Matthew looked back at the woman on the bench, Sarah. He didn't know her name yet, but he could read her posture the way he once read terrain, the way her shoulders curved inward, the way her hands clenched and unclenched as if bracing for another blow, the thinness of her coat, the exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes. She wasn't drunk, she wasn't reckless, she wasn't looking for trouble, she was stranded. Matthew had seen that look before, on refugees, on civilians caught between forces they never chose, on men who survived something they weren't supposed to. It was the look of someone who had nowhere left to go. "Daddy," one of the twins whispered again, barely audible over the distant city noise. "She's cold." Matthew exhaled slowly through his nose. He could feel the old reflex stirring inside him, the one that cataloged risk, calculated outcomes, searched for exits. Bringing a stranger home was not protocol, it wasn't safe, it wasn't logical, but neither was leaving someone to freeze on a bench. He turned back to Sarah. "Listen," he said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man used to the consequences of speech. "This isn't—" He paused, then started again. "I'm not offering you miracles." She looked up at him, eyes wary now, like an animal unsure whether kindness would turn sharp. "I have a house," he continued. "It's warm. It's big. Too big, honestly." A faint, almost self-deprecating smile flickered across his face and vanished just as quickly. "You can stay tonight, eat something, sleep in a real bed." Sarah blinked. "I don't—" She swallowed. "I don't have money." "I didn't ask," he replied. She searched his face, clearly waiting for the condition, the catch, the expectation hidden behind generosity. There wasn't one. "This is just shelter," Matthew added, his voice firm but calm. "Nothing else. Tomorrow, we figure out next steps." The girls watched Sarah closely now, as if silently voting. Sophie stepped forward and held out her gloved hand. "I'm Sophie," she said brightly. "You can come with us. Our house has hot chocolate." Zoe nodded enthusiastically. "And cookies. Sometimes Daddy burns them, but they're still good." One of the twins frowned thoughtfully. "We have blankets." That did it. Something inside Sarah cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to let warmth rush in where despair had settled. She looked at the hand offered to her, small, trusting, unafraid. Then she looked at Matthew again. "Just for tonight?" she asked softly. He nodded once, a promise without embellishment. "Just tonight." She took Sophie's hand. Matthew felt the shift immediately, the way the night seemed to exhale, the way the city noise dulled around the edges. He guided the girls toward the waiting car, his hand hovering protectively at Sarah's back without touching her. She noticed, didn't flinch. The drive was quiet at first. The girls sat bundled in the back seat, whispering to one another, sneaking curious glances at Sarah as if she might disappear if they stared too hard. Matthew drove with the steady focus of habit, his hands relaxed on the wheel. Sarah watched the city slide past the window, lights blurring, storefronts fading into shadows. She half expected this to dissolve like a dream, to wake up back on the bench, colder than before. "So," Zoe said suddenly, unable to contain herself any longer, "what's your name?" Sarah smiled faintly. "Sarah. That's a pretty name," Sophie declared. "Ours are pretty too. Daddy says Mommy picked them." The word Mommy landed gently but firmly in the car, like a stone dropped into still water. Matthew's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. Sarah noticed, but said nothing. The house stood back from the road, framed by bare winter trees and silence. Not a mansion in the ostentatious sense, no gates, no fountains, but solid, spacious, built to last. Sarah stared as Matthew pulled into the driveway. "This is your house?" she whispered. "Yes," he replied simply. Inside, the air was warm but still, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace but from absence. A Christmas tree stood in the living room, tall and decorated, though slightly crooked, as if someone had tried very hard and then stopped halfway through. "Sorry," Matthew said, shrugging out of his coat. "I'm not great at decorating." The girls immediately burst into motion, shedding hats and gloves, voices rising as they argued over cookies and cups. Sarah stood near the doorway, unsure where to put herself. "Come in," Matthew said gently. "You're freezing." She stepped inside. The house was beautiful and empty, not physically, but emotionally, like a body waiting for its heartbeat. "I can make—" "Something to eat," Matthew said, already heading toward the kitchen. He opened the fridge, stared into it for a moment too long, then sighed. "Fair warning, I'm better with emergencies than recipes. I can't help," Sarah offered instinctively. He turned, surprised. "You don't have to." "I know," she said, "but I want to." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." The kitchen filled with movement, Water running, pans clinking, the girls crowding in with questions and laughter. Sarah moved naturally, as if she had always belonged there. She chopped vegetables, stirred sauce, redirected small hands away from danger with gentle humor. Matthew leaned against the counter and watched. It had been 6 months since his wife died. 6 months of silence, of routines performed without joy, of nights ending in exhaustion rather than peace. And here was a woman he had met an hour ago, standing barefoot in his kitchen, bringing life back into a space that had forgotten how to breathe. When they finally sat down to eat, it wasn't fancy, just pasta, cheese, bread, but there was laughter, real laughter. Matthew felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, not pain, not guilt, but something lighter. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just relief. Sarah ate quietly, savoring warmth she hadn't realized she missed. When the girls talked over one another, she listened. When Matthew reached for something and missed, she passed it to him without comment. Nothing was forced, nothing was promised. And yet, as the night deepened and snow began to fall softly outside, all 6 of them felt it. This was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a shelter, not built of walls or money or plans, but of a single decision made in the cold. No one gets left behind. The house slept lightly that night, not in the deep, peaceful way homes are meant to sleep, but in the shallow, cautious way of places that had learned to expect loss. Sarah lay awake in the guest room, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling. The bed beneath her was wide and impossibly soft, the kind of bed that seemed to ask you to trust it. Warmth wrapped around her in layers, clean sheets, a thick blanket, air that did not bite. Hours earlier, she had been shivering on a park bench, convinced her life had folded in on itself for good. Now, she was here. Her mind refused to catch up. She sat up slowly, half expecting someone to knock and tell her there had been a mistake. No one came. The house remained quiet, save for the distant hum of heating and the soft tick of a clock somewhere down the hall. Sarah swung her legs over the edge of the bed and stood, moving carefully, as if sound itself might break the spell. The room was larger than the apartment she had shared with David, a private bathroom, towels folded with military precision, a window that looked out onto dark trees dusted with snow. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat, fast, uncertain, alive. Just for tonight, she reminded herself. But the night felt heavier than that, like a door left open too long. Down the hall, Matthew sat at the kitchen table long after the girls had gone to sleep. He had tucked them in himself, moving from room to room with quiet efficiency. Sophie had insisted on 1 extra story. Zoe had demanded a sip of water after already having 3. The twins had fallen asleep clutching the same worn stuffed rabbit, their foreheads smooth in a way that still caught him off guard. He kissed each of them goodnight, lingering a second longer than usual. When he finally came downstairs, the house greeted him with its familiar silence. Except now, it felt different. There was a faint smell of tomato sauce lingering in the air. A dish towel hung crookedly over the sink, not folded into the neat square he preferred. A chair was pushed back at an odd angle, signs of life. Matthew wrapped his hands around a mug of tea that had long gone cold and stared at the wall without really seeing it. His mind replayed the evening in fragments, the sound of laughter at the table, Sarah's soft voice calming the twins when they argued over napkins, the way the girls had gravitated toward her without hesitation. It unsettled him, not because it was wrong, but because it was right in a way he hadn't dared imagine. 6 months ago, his wife had been alive, laughing, complaining about the tree being crooked, filling this house with warmth that no amount of money or discipline could replace. Then she was gone, and the house had followed her into silence. Matthew had tried to hold it together the way he'd been trained to: structure, routine, control. He hired help, he followed schedules, he kept moving, but children didn't need control, they needed presence. And he hadn't known how to give it. Upstairs, Sarah finally drifted into sleep. She dreamed of warmth, of hands small and trusting, of a door that didn't close. When morning came, it arrived not with alarm clocks or dread, but with giggles, soft at first, then louder. Sarah stirred, confused, her mind scrambling to place herself. The bed was too big, the light too gentle. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest. Then memory returned. The bench, the girls, Matthew. The giggles grew bolder, accompanied by hushed whispers. I think she's still asleep. No, she's not. I can feel it. We should knock. No, surprise her. Sarah smiled before she could stop herself. "You can come in," she called, her voice rough with sleep. The door flew open. 4 small figures burst into the room like sunlight given legs, colorful pajamas, tangled blonde hair, eyes bright with excitement. "Good morning," Sophie announced, leaping onto the bed with practiced confidence. "Did you sleep good?" Zoe asked, climbing up beside her. "Are you staying today?" one of the twins asked. "Emma, or maybe Emily." "And are you having breakfast with us?" the other added quickly, not to be outdone. Sarah laughed, a sound that surprised her with its ease. "Slow down," she said gently. "One question at a time." Sophie grabbed her hand. "But you are staying, right?" The question was small, the weight was not. Sarah looked at the 4 faces staring up at her, hopeful, open, already attached. Something tightened in her chest, sharp and tender all at once. "I'm staying today," she said carefully. "Yes." The cheer that followed was loud enough to wake the dead. They dragged her out of bed before she could even find her slippers, pulling her down the hall and toward the stairs with unfiltered enthusiasm. Matthew woke to the sound of chaos, not the sharp, panicked chaos that had haunted his nights for months, but something lighter, something playful. He sat up in bed, listening. Laughter, footsteps, voices calling Sarah's name. Sarah. The name settled into his chest in a way he didn't expect. By the time he reached the kitchen, the girls were already there, climbing onto stools and arguing about cereal boxes. "What do you usually eat for breakfast?" Sarah asked, scanning the cabinets. "Cereal," Sophie said. "Every day," Zoe added, as if this were a grave injustice. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "How about pancakes?" The reaction was immediate and dramatic. "Pancakes?" Matthew stopped in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. Flour appeared on the counter. Eggs were cracked with questionable success. Milk sloshed dangerously close to the edge of the bowl. One egg hit the floor, and Emma burst into tears, convinced she had ruined everything. Sarah crouched beside her instantly. "It's okay," she said softly, wiping the mess with a towel. "Pancakes forgive mistakes." Matthew blinked. No raised voice, no tension, just calm. The kitchen filled with the smell of batter and laughter. Sarah tied a dish towel around her waist like an apron, flour smudged on her cheek. The girls took turns stirring, each convinced she was doing the most important part. Matthew leaned against the counter, coffee forgotten in his hand. He had led teams through hostile territory with less uncertainty than he felt watching this. But, unlike those missions, this one didn't demand command. It demanded trust. Breakfast was messy and loud and imperfect, and it was the best morning they'd had in half a year. After they ate, the girls followed Sarah from room to room, as if tethered by invisible strings. When she sat, they sat. When she stood, they stood. The twins climbed into her lap with wordless certainty, their heads resting against her, as though they had always belonged there. Matthew watched from a distance, pretending to check emails on his phone. He didn't fool himself. He was witnessing something sacred. The house breathed again, not deeply, not yet, but enough to remind him it still could. By mid-morning, the girls had settled into a quiet rhythm, drawing at the table, telling stories that made little sense but demanded full attention, curling up beside Sarah as if proximity itself was nourishment. Matthew stepped outside briefly, letting the cold air clear his head. He stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, staring out at the snow-covered yard. He had invited a stranger into his home, against logic, against caution, and yet, every instinct he trusted told him this was right, not permanent, not defined, just right. Inside, Sarah sat on the floor with the girls, reading from a children's book about a princess who got lost and followed the stars home. Her voice was soft, steady. The twins dozed against her shoulders. Zoe yawned dramatically. Sophie fought sleep with determination, worthy of a soldier. Matthew watched from the doorway, unseen. For the first time since his wife died, the house did not feel like a memorial. It felt like a beginning. And beginnings, he knew, were fragile things. They required care, patience, and courage. As the story ended and 4 small bodies surrendered to sleep, Matthew understood something with a clarity that surprised him. This woman had not come to save them. She had come because she, too, needed saving. And somehow, in the quiet breathing of a house that had forgotten how to live, they were doing both, together. That night, the house did not fall silent the way it used to. It settled. There was a difference, subtle but undeniable. Silence before had been heavy, like a held breath that never quite released. This silence was softer, woven with echoes of laughter still clinging to the walls, with the faint memory of footsteps and voices drifting through the rooms. Sarah stood in the kitchen, rinsing plates beneath warm water. The rhythmic sound of it soothed her. She had offered to help clean without thinking, the way one does when trying to make themselves useful, when gratitude overflows and has nowhere else to go. "You really don't have to do that," Matthew said from the doorway. She glanced over her shoulder. He stood there barefoot now, sleeves rolled up, posture less rigid than before, still controlled, but no longer braced for impact. "I know," she replied with a small smile, "but I want to." That answer seemed to satisfy him. He stepped inside and reached for a towel, drying plates as she passed them to him. They worked in quiet coordination, the kind that usually took years to develop. No awkwardness, no need for conversation, just presence. When the kitchen was clean, Matthew gestured toward the hallway. "Let me show you the guest room." The room waited patiently, as if it had been prepared for her long before she arrived. The bed was wide and neatly made. Lamps glowed softly. The curtains were half drawn, revealing a pale wash of moonlight over snow-dusted trees. Sarah stopped just inside the doorway. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Matthew nodded. "Bathroom's through there. Towels are fresh. If you need anything, my room's at the end of the hall." He hesitated, then added, "Anything at all." "Thank you," she said. The words felt too small. He lingered another second, as if considering something he chose not to say, then stepped back. "Good night, Sarah." "Good night, Matthew." The door closed gently behind him. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, breathing in the unfamiliar scent of clean linen and quiet. Her mind replayed the day in fragments: the bench, the question, the girl's hands in hers, flower in her hair, laughter in the kitchen. She pressed her palm against the mattress. Soft, real. For the first time in weeks, she lay down without bracing herself for disappointment. Sleep came quickly. Matthew did not sleep. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the subtle sounds of the house, the distant hum of heat, the settling of wood, the gentle rhythm of his daughter's breathing down the hall. And beneath it all, something new, not noise, life. He turned onto his side, memories pressing in. His wife's laugh, the way she used to sit on the edge of the bed and complain about the twins stealing all the blankets. The smell of her shampoo lingering long after she'd left the room. Grief did not roar tonight. It whispered, and for the first time, it did not own the room. Morning arrived with mischief. Sarah woke to the sensation of being watched. She opened her eyes to find 4 faces hovering inches from her own, their expressions a mix of awe and barely contained excitement. "She's awake," Zoe whispered far too loudly. "I told you she would be," Sophie replied smugly. The twins smiled in unison, as if sharing a secret language. Sarah laughed softly, sitting up. "Good morning. Are you staying again today?" Sophie asked immediately, skipping pleasantries. Sarah paused, not because she didn't want to, but because the weight of the question deserved care. "I'm here today," she said. "Yes." That was enough. They pulled her from the bed once more, insisting on showing her everything. Their rooms, their drawings, the spot in the hallway where the floor creaked just right. In Sophie's room, drawings covered the walls in colorful chaos. Families, houses, stick figures holding hands. Sophie pointed proudly. "That's Daddy. That's us. Mommy's in heaven." Sarah knelt beside her. "She must have been amazing." "She was," Sophie said simply. Then she picked up a crayon and hesitated. "Can I draw you?" Sarah's throat tightened. "Of course." When Sophie finished, she held up the paper. A woman with brown hair stood beside the 4 girls, smiling. "There," Sophie said. "Now it's complete." Sarah blinked rapidly, fighting tears. Downstairs, Matthew watched from the kitchen as the girls swarmed around Sarah like planets around a sun. He poured coffee and forgot to drink it. Something inside him shifted. Not fear, not resistance. Recognition. Later that afternoon, snow began to fall again, soft and persistent. The girls pressed their noses to the windows, arguing over whose turn it was to describe the shapes in the clouds. Sarah sat on the floor with them, listening intently to a story that involved a dragon, a rabbit, and flying pizza. She asked questions as if it all made perfect sense. Matthew leaned against the wall, arms crossed, observing. 6 months ago, this house had been a battlefield of quiet despair. He had walked its halls like a ghost, afraid of saying the wrong thing, of not being enough. Now, laughter echoed, not loud, but real. That evening, after dinner, the girls grew sleepy. Sarah read them a story, using different voices, deep and growly for the dragon, soft and brave for the princess. Halfway through, the twins were asleep, heads leaning together. Zoe yawned every other sentence. Sophie fought valiantly until the very last page. When it was over, Sarah kissed each forehead gently. "Sleep tight, my loves," she whispered. Matthew stood in the doorway, heart heavy and full all at once. Later, he found Sarah in the kitchen again, putting away dishes. "Thank you," he said quietly. She turned. "For what?" "For today, for them." He hesitated. "For me." She smiled, not wide, not triumphant, just warm. "Thank you for giving me a place to land." They stood there, the house breathing softly around them. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, erasing sharp edges, making space for something new. For the first time since everything had broken, both of them felt it. Not certainty, not answers, but belonging. And sometimes, that was enough. Morning announced itself with a smell, not the sharp bitterness of coffee or the sterile quiet of routine, but something softer, sweet, warm, unmistakably human. Butter melting, batter meeting heat, the faint hiss of a pan doing honest work. Matthew woke before his alarm. For a moment he lay still, disoriented. His body expected urgency, orders, the old reflex to scan for danger. Instead, there was only warmth drifting down the hallway and the muffled sound of small feet padding across the floor. He sat up. The house was awake. Downstairs, Sarah stood at the stove in one of Matthew's old flannel shirts, sleeves rolled too far past her wrists. She had tied a dish towel around her waist like an apron. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot that had already surrendered to flyaways. The kitchen was chaos. Flour dusted the counter like fresh snow. A bowl sat precariously close to the edge of the island. One of the twins, Emma, he thought, was standing on a stool, gripping a wooden spoon with fierce concentration. Emily watched closely, determined not to be outdone. Zoe hovered nearby, stealing blueberries when she thought no one was looking. Sophie supervised the scene with the solemn authority of a general. "Okay," Sarah said gently, holding up her hands. "Rule number 1, everyone gets a turn." "I already had my turn," Zoe protested, blueberry-stained fingers betraying her. "That was stealing," Sophie corrected. "It was quality control," Zoe replied. Sarah bit her lip to keep from laughing. "How about this? We all stir together." She handed out spoons like medals. Matthew leaned against the doorway, unnoticed, coffee mug warming his hands. He watched as the girls leaned in, stirring with enthusiasm that far exceeded skill. Batter splashed. Flour puffed into the air. One egg cracked too hard and slid onto the floor with a soft, traitorous splat. Emma froze. Her lower lip trembled. "I ruined it." Sarah crouched instantly, level with her. "Hey," she said softly, "look at me." Emma looked up, eyes glossy with tears. "Pancakes forgive mistakes," Sarah repeated with a smile. "And so do we." She wiped the floor, cracked another egg, and handed it back without ceremony. Emma beamed. Matthew's chest tightened. He had spent months trying to solve problems with structure and control, convinced that discipline could replace gentleness. Watching Sarah, he realized how wrong he had been. Breakfast was loud, imperfect, joyfully inefficient. Pancakes emerged misshapen but golden. Blueberries burst under forks. Syrup dripped onto plates and fingers alike. The twins argued over who got the heart-shaped one until Matthew intervened, cutting it cleanly in half. "There," he said. "Even missions require compromise." The girls giggled, accepting the solution as law. They ate together at the big table, 6 chairs finally filled. The girls talked over one another, retelling stories Matthew had already heard, twice, but he listened anyway. Sarah passed napkins, wiped chins, laughed freely. This was what the house had been missing. After breakfast, the girls scattered. Sophie gathered her drawings with purpose. Zoe declared it story time and dragged Sarah to the living room floor. The twins climbed onto Sarah's lap without asking, their trust immediate and absolute. Sarah didn't resist. She sat cross-legged on the rug, one twin on each thigh, Zoe curled at her side, Sophie nearby with a book open but forgotten. Sarah listened to Zoe's story, something involving a dragon who was afraid of the dark, and a rabbit who taught him courage. It made no sense. It made perfect sense. Matthew pretended to answer emails from his phone, but his attention never left the room. He watched how Sarah leaned in, how she asked questions that invited more imagination, how she laughed at the right moments. The girls were calm, happy. They weren't clinging to her out of fear. They were choosing her. By midday, snow fell thicker, blanketing the yard in quiet white. The girls pressed their faces to the window, debating whether snow angels or Coco should come first. Coco won. Sarah lined mugs on the counter, adding marshmallows with ceremonial importance. The twins blew on theirs too hard, sending marshmallows skidding across the surface. Zoe laughed so hard she snorted. Matthew joined them, rolling up his sleeves, wiping spills without complaint. At some point, he realized he wasn't watching the clock. The afternoon slipped by unnoticed. Toys migrated across the living room. Pillows became mountains. Blankets transformed into capes and forts. When one of the twins grew cranky, Sarah scooped her up without hesitation, rocking gently until her breathing evened out. Matthew watched, something old and painful loosening in his chest. He had been so afraid of doing it wrong that he had often done nothing at all. As dusk settled, Matthew found himself standing beside Sarah at the sink. "You're good with them," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "I just listen." He considered that. Later, as the girls washed up and changed into pajamas, Matthew helped where he could, brushing hair awkwardly, buttoning sleeves that resisted him. Sarah offered quiet guidance without judgment. "Like this," she murmured, showing him how to braid Sophie's hair. "Slow. Don't rush." His hands fumbled. Sophie giggled. The braid leaned slightly to one side. "It's perfect," Sophie declared. Matthew smiled, something easing in his shoulders. The storm arrived without asking permission. It did not creep in politely or announce itself with distant thunder. It came fast, loud, and unafraid. Wind slamming against the windows like fists, rain striking the roof with frantic insistence. By the time Matthew pulled into the driveway that evening, the sky had turned the color of old steel. Inside, dinner was already on the table. Sarah had made soup. Simple, warm, dependable. The kind of meal meant to steady small stomachs and anxious hearts. The girls had helped, of course. Carrots cut into uneven shapes. Too much salt that Sarah quietly corrected. A bay leaf Zoe insisted was for magic. They sat together as the wind howled. "Daddy," Sophie said, glancing toward the window. "It's really loud." Matthew smiled, reaching for her hand. "It's just a storm, sweetheart. It can't hurt us." As if offended by his confidence, thunder cracked overhead, sharp, immediate. Emma whimpered. Emily clutched her sister's sleeve. Sarah stood instinctively, moving behind the twins' chairs, her hands resting lightly on their shoulders. "It's okay," she said calmly. "Just noise, big clouds talking to each other." Zoe frowned. "They sound angry." "Sometimes clouds argue," Sarah replied. "Just like people, but they always calm down." Matthew watched her carefully, the way she didn't rush, didn't panic, the way her voice stayed steady even as the storm pressed closer. Then the lights flickered, once, twice, and went out. Darkness swallowed the room. Emma screamed. Emily followed, the sound sharp and piercing. Sophie jumped to her feet, knocking over her chair as she ran to her father. Zoe froze in place, eyes wide, breath caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. Matthew stood up too fast. His heart slammed against his ribs, muscle memory igniting before thought could intervene. Darkness, noise, chaos. For a split second, he was not in his dining room. He was somewhere else entirely, surrounded by danger without exits. He fumbled for his phone. His hands shook. "Daddy, I can't see," Sophie cried, clinging to his leg. "I'm here," he said, though his voice betrayed him. "I'm right here." The twins' cries escalated, feeding off each other, panic multiplying. Matthew tried to speak, to calm them, but the words tangled. His mind raced, searching for control and finding none. Then Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. "Matthew," she said firmly, not loud, not sharp, just grounded. "Stay with them." He looked at her. She was already moving. She grabbed her phone, turned on the flashlight, and disappeared down the hall. Her footsteps were quick but purposeful, like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Matthew swallowed, forcing himself to focus. "I've got you," he said, kneeling despite the noise inside his head. "I've got you." The girls clung to him, crying, breathless. Sarah returned less than a minute later, carrying 3 large flashlights. She flicked them on one by one, setting them upright on the table and counter. Warm yellow light bloomed across the room, pushing the darkness back. "There," she said gently, smiling at the girls. "See, light always comes back." The twins' cries softened into sniffles. Zoe wiped her nose. "Is it going to stay dark forever?" Sarah crouched down to their level. "No. But since it's dark right now, how about we make it fun?" The girls hesitated, curiosity peeking through fear. "Fun?" Sophie repeated. "Yes," Sarah said, eyes bright. "Who wants to go camping?" Silence. Then Zoe blinked. "Camping? Like inside?" "Exactly," Sarah replied. "An indoor campout, with a tent, and stories, and magic lights." Emma sniffed. "With blankets?" "With lots of blankets." Emily nodded slowly. "And pillows?" "All the pillows you want." The fear shifted. Not gone, but transformed. Matthew stared at Sarah, stunned. In less than 30 seconds, she had turned terror into anticipation. "I'll get sheets," he said quickly, grateful for something concrete to do. He grabbed a flashlight and hurried upstairs, gathering armfuls of blankets, pillows, spare sheets. He moved with renewed purpose, no longer trapped in his own fear. When he returned, the living room was already changing. Sarah had positioned the flashlights around the room, angling them upward to cast soft shadows. She lit a few thick emergency candles on the mantel, safely out of reach, their flames flickering like a hearth. "Look," she said, pointing. "It's like a campfire." The girls stared, enchanted. Matthew helped stretch sheets between the sofa and armchairs, tying corners with knots he hadn't used since training exercises. They worked together, wordless, efficient, a team. In 10 minutes, a tent stood where the living room had been, not perfect, but strong. "Wow," Sophie whispered, crawling inside. "It's beautiful." The others followed, laughter bubbling up as fear drained away. They sprawled across blankets and pillows, faces glowing in the soft, diffused light. Matthew ducked inside last, awkward with his size, but the girls made room without complaint. Outside the tent, the storm raged. Inside, it softened into background noise. "Okay," Zoe announced proudly, raising her hand. "Story time," Sarah smiled. "You go first." Zoe launched into a tale about a dragon who lived on a mountain and ate pizza because fire made it taste better. The details grew wilder by the second. Sarah listened intently, asking questions. Matthew followed her lead. "Did the dragon breathe fire?" he asked solemnly. "Yes," Zoe said seriously, "but blue fire, because blue fire is nicer." "Of course," Matthew agreed. "Much nicer." The girls laughed. Sophie told the next story, about a princess who saved a prince. Matthew exaggerated the prince's voice, dramatically fainting at the end. The twins tried to tell a story together and ended up arguing over who spoke first until Sarah gently helped them take turns. Time slowed, fear faded. One by one, yawns appeared. "I'm sleepy," Emma murmured. "Me too," Emily echoed, curling closer. Sarah adjusted the blankets, pulling the twins into her arms without hesitation. They settled instantly, breathing evening out. Zoe fought sleep valiantly, eyes fluttering. Sophie rested her head near Matthew's shoulder, her hand finding his. "Daddy," she whispered, "I like camping." Matthew kissed her forehead. "Me too." The storm continued outside, loud and unrelenting. Inside the tent, the world was small and safe. Matthew looked around, 4 girls asleep, or nearly so, Sarah in the center, holding the twins as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Zoe leaning against her shoulder, Sophie's fingers curled around his. Something in his chest cracked open. This was what he had been missing. Not control, connection. He pulled a blanket over them all, careful not to wake anyone. Sarah looked up at him, their eyes meeting in the dim light. She smiled, not triumphant, not proud, just there. He lay down beside them, closing the circle. The light stayed out, but no one noticed anymore. As sleep claimed him, Matthew realized the truth with quiet certainty. He had faced storms far worse than this one, but this was the first time he wasn't facing it alone, and that made all the difference. The house woke slowly after the storm. Morning light slipped through the windows in thin, cautious ribbons, as if unsure whether it was welcome yet. The rain had washed the world clean, leaving the air crisp and sharp. Somewhere outside, a bird tested the silence with a tentative song. Inside the living room, the tent still stood, blankets sagged, sheets hung unevenly, pillows were scattered like fallen clouds. And beneath them all, 5 bodies slept tangled together in a way no plan could have designed. Matthew woke first. Sophie was curled against his side, her small hand wrapped firmly around his finger, as if anchoring herself to him. The twins were pressed against Sarah's chest, their breaths soft and even. Zoe lay sprawled half across Sarah's legs, one sock missing, her face peaceful in a way that made Matthew's throat tighten. Sarah slept too. Her hair had come loose during the night, strands falling across her face. One arm rested protectively around the twins, instinctive and sure. Even in sleep, she was guarding them. Matthew didn't move. He had spent years training himself to wake instantly, alert and ready. But this required stillness, reverence. He watched them breathe, and something inside him finally broke. Not loudly, not violently, just enough to let the truth surface. For months he had told himself he was coping, that he was managing, that he was doing what needed to be done. He had survived worse than grief. He had endured things that would have crushed other men. But standing watch over sleeping children was a different kind of test. One, he had been failing. Carefully, Matthew shifted, easing Sophie back onto a pillow without waking her. He stood and moved quietly to the kitchen, starting the coffee maker out of habit more than need. The smell filled the air. Behind him, the house stirred. Sarah emerged a few minutes later, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her steps careful not to wake the girls. "Good morning," she whispered. Matthew turned. "Morning." They stood there, the silence between them full but not awkward. The tent loomed behind them like a memory made solid. "Did they sleep?" she asked softly. "Like champions," he replied. Then, after a pause, "You too." She smiled faintly. "I haven't slept like that in a long time." Neither had he. They poured coffee and sat at the table, hands wrapped around warm mugs. Outside, the sky had softened to pale blue. The world looked forgiving. Matthew stared into his cup for a long moment. "Can I tell you something?" he asked finally. Sarah looked up at him, attentive. "Of course." He nodded once, as if bracing himself. "I don't know how to be a father." The words hung there, bare and unarmored. Sarah didn't interrupt. "I mean, I know how to protect them," he continued, his voice low. "I know how to provide. I know how to plan for worst-case scenarios." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I can dismantle a weapon in the dark. I can stay calm under fire." He looked at her then, eyes shadowed. "But when they cry, I freeze." Sarah felt her chest ache. "When my wife died," Matthew went on, "everything fell apart. Sophie tried to be brave. Zoe got louder. The twins—" He swallowed. "They were so small. They needed their mother, and I wasn't her." He set his mug down, hands tightening. "They cried at night, all 4 of them, sometimes at the same time." His jaw clenched. I'd stand in the hallway, listening, telling myself to just go in, just pick one up, say something. But I didn't know what. Sarah leaned forward slightly, but still didn't speak. "So I hired help," he said. "Nannies. 5 of them in 6 months. None stayed. They said the girls were difficult, too needy." He shook his head. "They weren't difficult. They were grieving." His voice cracked on the last word. "For a while I thought about sending the twins to my mother-in-law, just for a bit, until I figured things out." He rubbed a hand over his face, shame etched into every movement. "I stood in their room that night, watching them sleep. Emma holding that stupid rabbit, Emily sucking her thumb." Tears filled his eyes. "And I thought, maybe they'd be better off without me." The confession landed like a wound finally exposed to air. Sarah reached across the table and took his hands. "Matthew," she said gently. He looked up, eyes wet and raw. "You didn't fail them," she continued. "You were drowning." He shook his head. "A real father wouldn't—" "No," she interrupted softly but firmly. "A real father would be exactly where you are right now, admitting he's scared, admitting he needs help." He searched her face, desperate and uncertain. "I yell sometimes," he admitted, "over stupid things. Spilled milk, toys on the floor. I hate myself for it." She squeezed his hands. "Then we'll work on that." He blinked. "We?" "Yes," Sarah said simply. "We." She shifted closer, her voice calm and sure. "Your girls don't need perfection," she said. "They need you, present, on their level." She demonstrated by lowering her body slightly, meeting his eyes. When you talk to them, get down like this. Look them in the eye. Let them see you're listening. He nodded slowly. Explain things, even if it takes time. Especially if it takes time, she continued. And touch matters more than words sometimes. A hug, a hand on their back, a kiss on the forehead. She smiled faintly. They calm faster when they feel safe. Matthew absorbed every word like doctrine. And you, she added, softer now, you're allowed to learn, you're allowed to grieve, you're allowed to be human. Something inside him finally gave way. Matthew stood abruptly and pulled her into a hug, not polite, not restrained. He held her like a lifeline. Sarah wrapped her arms around him without hesitation, letting him shake, letting him breathe, letting him break in a way he never had before. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were red, but lighter. "Thank you," he whispered. She smiled gently. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." From the living room came a small voice. "Daddy?" Sophie stood there, rubbing her eyes. Matthew wiped his face quickly and smiled. "Hey, sweetheart." She patted over and climbed into his lap without asking, curling against him. "I had a bad dream. But then I remembered camping." He kissed the top of her head. "Me too." Zoe and the twins appeared moments later, drawn by instinct more than sound. Soon they were all piled around him again, the morning reclaiming its rhythm. Sarah watched the scene quietly. The man who had once stood frozen in hallways was now holding his children without fear. Not because he had changed overnight, but because he had finally admitted the truth. And in that admission, something stronger than discipline had begun to grow. Love, unarmored, imperfect, and real, the kind that stays. The days that followed did not arrive with ceremony. They came quietly, stacking themselves one atop another like stones placed by careful hands. Nothing dramatic changed, and yet everything did. Matthew went back to work the following Monday. The morning routine felt foreign at first. Suit instead of flannel, polished shoes instead of bare feet on cold tile. He stood in the hallway, adjusting his tie while Sarah moved through the kitchen behind him, packing lunches with a practiced calm that still surprised them both. "You don't have to do that," he said for the third time, glancing at the lunch bags. Sarah smiled without looking up. "I know." That answer again. The girls hovered nearby, already dressed, shoes mismatched, but spirits high. Sophie checked her backpack twice. Zoe told a story no one asked for, but everyone listened to anyway. The twins argued over which one got to hold Sarah's hand while walking to the door. Matthew paused at the threshold. He had left his daughters many times before. Early mornings, late nights, goodbyes rushed and distracted. But this time felt different. He hesitated, heart tugging in an unfamiliar way. "You'll be okay?" he asked Sarah quietly. She met his eyes. "We will." That included him. He nodded once and left, the door closing behind him with a soft finality that no longer sounded like abandonment. At the office, Matthew tried to focus. He answered emails, attended meetings, gave instructions with his usual clarity. But something had shifted. His thoughts kept drifting, not back to the past, but forward, to pancakes and spilled flour, to a living room tent, to a woman who listened more than she spoke. He checked his phone far more often than necessary. No missed calls, no emergencies. For the first time in months, the silence felt good. Back at the house, Sarah established a rhythm. She didn't impose rules or overhaul routines. She simply filled the gaps, reading aloud in the mornings, setting aside time for play, encouraging naps that somehow transformed the twins from chaos into angels by dinner time. She gave the girls small responsibilities, folding towels, putting toys away, choosing books. It made them feel important, seen. The house responded. When Matthew came home that evening, he stopped just inside the door. The living room was quiet, but not empty. Sarah sat on the sofa reading softly. Emma slept against her left shoulder, Emily against her right. Zoe leaned nearby, fighting sleep with determination that was clearly losing. Sophie lay stretched across the cushions, listening intently, eyes heavy but focused. The Christmas tree lights blinked in the corner, casting a golden glow that softened every edge. Matthew didn't move. He watched. 6 months ago, this sight would have shattered him. It would have reminded him too sharply of what he had lost. Tonight, it did something else entirely. It stitched. He stepped forward carefully. Sarah looked up, startled, then smiled. He raised a finger to his lips and nodded toward the sleeping girls. She nodded back. Together, silently, they transferred each child to bed. Matthew carried Sophie. Sarah took Zoe. The twins went last, undisturbed in their sleep. When they returned to the living room, the space felt larger, too quiet. Matthew exhaled. They were, peaceful. Sarah nodded. They're learning they're safe. He looked at her. So am I. That night, they stood side by side in the kitchen, washing dishes without speaking. The comfort of it surprised them both. I've been thinking, Matthew said eventually. Sarah waited. I don't want you to feel like you're filling a role, he continued carefully. You're not here to replace anyone. She turned to face him fully. I know, she said softly. I don't want to replace anyone either. Relief passed through his features, quick and unguarded. My wife... He stopped, searching for words. She was extraordinary. This house was hers, long before it was mine. I can feel that, Sarah said. In the walls, in the way the girls talk about her. He nodded. Loving you wouldn't erase her. The words surprised him as soon as they left his mouth. Sarah's breath caught, but she didn't look away. Loving you, he repeated more quietly, feels like learning how to live again. Not forgetting. She swallowed. I was afraid of that too, she admitted. That loving again would mean betraying what I lost. They stood there, the truth settling between them like something fragile, but welcome. In the days that followed, Matthew began to change, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in ways that mattered. He came home earlier, canceled late meetings, reorganized priorities that had once seemed immovable. When he walked through the door now, the girls ran to him, not with desperate need, but with excitement. He learned to sit on the floor, to listen to Zoe's stories all the way to the end, no matter how nonsensical. To draw with Sophie, even though his houses leaned and his stick figures looked more like soldiers than people. To hold the twins when they asked, instead of hesitating. Sarah watched quietly, pride swelling in her chest. One afternoon, she found Sophie at the table drawing alone. Where's everyone? Sarah asked. Daddy's playing blocks with the twins, Sophie replied, and Zoe's telling him a story. Sarah smiled. Later that evening, Matthew joined her in the kitchen, drying dishes as she washed. You were right, he said suddenly. About what? Being at their level, he said. It works. She laughed softly. Children are small, not simple. He considered that. I spent so long trying to lead them. They just needed me to walk with them. Something warm passed between them then. Not a spark, something steadier. That night, after the girls were asleep, Matthew lingered in the living room, instead of retreating to his office. Sarah joined him on the sofa with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. They sat close, shoulders nearly touching. Do you ever miss what you thought your life would be? He asked quietly. Sarah considered the question. I miss the idea, she said honestly, the picture I carried for years, the husband, the children I imagined. He waited. But this, she continued, gesturing around them, feels more real than anything I planned. I didn't give birth to those girls, but I choose them, every day. His heart beat faster. I choose you, she added softly. Matthew closed his eyes for a brief moment, overwhelmed by the simplicity and weight of it. When he opened them, he turned toward her fully. I don't know how fast is too fast, he said, but I know what feels true. She nodded. Me too. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time, hands entwined, the house breathing around them. Somewhere down the hall, a child stirred and sighed in her sleep. Matthew realized something then, something that felt like both an ending and a beginning. Sarah had not come to replace his wife. She had come to return him to himself, and in doing so, she had found her way home too. Matthew had faced enemy fire without flinching. He had stood in places where the air itself felt hostile, where every sound carried danger, where hesitation could cost lives. He had learned to act, to decide, to move forward even when fear pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. But this was different. He stood alone in the kitchen late one evening, staring at the dark window as his reflection stared back at him. The house behind him was quiet now, not the hollow quiet of grief, but the gentle stillness of sleep. All 4 girls were tucked in. Sarah was upstairs, reading in the guest room, unaware that Matthew's world was slowly, irrevocably changing. He had not planned this. He had not planned to let someone in, had not planned to feel again, had certainly not planned to love. And yet, love had a way of arriving unannounced, slipping past defenses built for entirely different wars. He heard soft footsteps behind him. Sarah stopped in the doorway, hesitant, as if sensing the gravity of the moment without knowing its shape. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Matthew turned. The light from the stove cast gentle shadows across her face, highlighting the calm strength he had come to rely on more than he realized. "Can you sit with me?" he asked. She nodded and joined him at the table, folding her hands together, waiting. He took a breath, then another. "I've been acting strange," he said finally. She smiled faintly. "A little." He huffed a quiet laugh, then grew serious again. "There's something I need to say, and I don't know how." Sarah's heart began to race, but she didn't interrupt. "When my wife died," Matthew began, his voice low, steady, but tight, "I thought that part of my life was over. Not the marriage part, the feeling part. I thought love was something I'd already used up." He looked down at his hands. "I told myself my job was just to survive, to raise the girls, to function." She listened, breathing carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter what he was building. "And then you showed up," he continued, "on a bench, in the cold, broken in a way I recognized." He met her eyes. "You didn't come in loud. You didn't demand space. You didn't try to fix us." His voice softened. "You just stayed." Sarah swallowed. "I watched you with my daughters," he said, "not replacing their mother, not trying to be anything you're not, just loving them, choosing them." His throat tightened. "And somewhere along the way, without realizing it, I started choosing you too." The words hung between them, fragile and undeniable. Sarah's breath caught, but she didn't look away. "I didn't plan to fall in love again," Matthew said, voice rough now. "Especially not this fast, especially not when everything still feels tender." He reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand, as if giving her space even now. "But I am in love with you, Sarah." Silence followed, not heavy, not empty, full. Sarah closed her eyes for a brief moment, steadying herself. When she opened them, there were tears, but also clarity. "I was afraid," she admitted softly, "afraid that if I loved you, it would mean my pain never mattered, that what I lost would be erased." He shook his head immediately. "Never." "I know," she said. "I know that now." She reached for his hand, her fingers warm, certain. "I love you too," she said, "not because I needed to be saved, but because you saw me when I felt invisible." Matthew let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Relief washed over his face, followed by something deeper, joy edged with awe. He stood slowly and pulled her into his arms, not urgently, not desperately, just enough. Sarah rested her forehead against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, strong, steady, real. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her as if she belonged there, because she did. They stayed like that for a long time, the house bearing witness. The walls that had once echoed with grief now held something gentler, something braver. Eventually, Sarah pulled back slightly and smiled through her tears. "What about the girls?" Matthew smiled too. "They already chose you." As if on cue, a small voice drifted down the hallway. "Daddy?" Sophie stood at the top of the stairs, half asleep. Matthew released Sarah reluctantly and knelt, opening his arms. Sophie padded over and climbed into them, curling against him. "I couldn't sleep," she murmured. "That's okay," he said, kissing her hair. "We're right here." She glanced at Sarah, then smiled sleepily. "Good." Matthew carried Sophie back upstairs, Sarah following quietly. They tucked her in together, side by side, their movements synchronized in a way that felt natural rather than practiced. Back downstairs, Matthew stopped near the foot of the stairs. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like," he said honestly. Sarah smiled. "Neither do I." He reached for her hand again. "But I know who I want to face it with." She squeezed his fingers. "Then that's enough." They didn't kiss that night. They didn't need to. Love had already spoken. And in a house once ruled by silence, the words he had never planned to say had finally found their home. Love did not arrive like a ceremony. There were no declarations carved into stone, no sudden certainty that erased fear, no moment where the past politely stepped aside. Instead, love settled in the way mornings do, quietly, insistently, one after another, until it became impossible to remember life before its light. 6 months later, the house woke differently, not to alarms or rushed footsteps, but to movement layered with purpose. The soft thud of small feet running down the stairs, the clatter of plates, the low hum of a man making coffee badly but earnestly. Matthew stood at the stove, frowning at a pan that refused to cooperate. "I think it's burning," he muttered. Sarah leaned against the counter, smiling. "You think?" He glanced at her over his shoulder, mock offended. "I'm improving." "You are," she agreed gently. "Just maybe not at breakfast." The girls burst into laughter as if on cue. Sophie entered first, already dressed, hair braided neatly, by Sarah's hands, though Matthew had watched carefully this time. Zoe followed, still wearing pajamas inside out, clutching a notebook filled with wild drawings and wilder ideas. The twins came last, hand in hand, eyes still heavy with sleep. "Pancakes?" Zoe asked hopefully. Matthew winced. "Let's not push our luck." Sarah stepped in beside him, flipped the pancake with effortless grace, and slid it onto a plate. "Pancakes," she confirmed. The cheer that followed rattled the walls. This was how mornings worked now. Not perfect, but alive. The house had learned their rhythms. Shoes lined up by the door, mostly. Drawings taped to the refrigerator in uneven rows. A calendar on the wall filled with small, important notes. School play, dentist, Zoe's show and tell, Emma and Emily, nap time. Matthew no longer left before sunrise. He had made a decision after the night of the storm, quietly, firmly, the way he made all decisions that mattered. He reorganized his work, canceled late meetings, drew boundaries he had once thought impossible. He left the office by 5, every day, without exception. The first afternoon he came home early, the girls stared at him as if he were a miracle. "You're home," Sophie said, stunned. "I am," he replied, "and I will be." They tested that promise, and he kept it. Matthew learned how to sit on the floor without checking his watch. He learned how to listen to Zoe's stories all the way to the end, even when they wandered through clouds, dragons, and pizza. He learned that the twins didn't always need solutions. Sometimes they just needed arms. Sarah watched the transformation with quiet pride. The man who had once frozen at the sound of crying now knelt to tie shoelaces. The soldier who had trusted only structure now trusted instinct. Love had not softened him into someone else. It had returned him to himself. One afternoon, Sophie sat at the kitchen table drawing, while Matthew dried dishes beside Sarah. "Daddy," Sophie said suddenly, "we had to draw our family at school today." Matthew's hands stilled. "Oh?" Sophie nodded. "I drew you, and Zoe, and Emma and Emily." She hesitated, then added, "and Sarah." Matthew felt his chest tighten. "Did the teacher like it?" "She put it on the wall," Sophie said proudly. "She said it looked happy." Sarah turned away quickly, pretending to rinse a plate. Later that night, when the girls were asleep and the house rested in its new, gentle silence, Matthew and Sarah sat together on the sofa. Outside, the street was dark. Inside, the lights glowed warm and steady. "I used to think family was something you were given," Matthew said quietly. "Or something you lost." Sarah rested her head against his shoulder. "Sometimes it's something you choose." He nodded. "I didn't choose this life." She smiled. "Neither did I." He turned to look at her, really look at her, the woman who had once been discarded as defective, as incomplete, as not enough, and now stood at the center of everything that mattered. "You are not a replacement," he said softly, echoing words spoken long ago. "You are a return." Sarah felt tears rise, but she smiled through them. "So are you." They kissed then, not hurried, not desperate. A kiss built on trust, on shared mornings and quiet nights, on storms survived together. The girls sensed the change before it was ever spoken. Children always do. They noticed the way Matthew reached for Sarah's hand without thinking, the way Sarah's voice softened when she said his name, the way the house seemed to hum with something warm and steady. One evening, as they gathered for a movie night, Zoe climbed onto the sofa, wedging herself between Matthew and Sarah. "So," she said casually, "are we a family now?" Matthew and Sarah exchanged a glance. Sophie looked up from her blanket. The twins paused mid-giggle. "Yes," Matthew said without hesitation. Zoe nodded, satisfied. "Okay." That was all the ceremony they needed. The movie played on. The girls sang along. The twins fell asleep halfway through. Sarah held them, one on each arm. Matthew wrapped a blanket around all of them. He looked around the room. at the house that had once been empty despite its size, at the children who had lost a mother and found another kind of one, at the woman who had lost everything and built something stronger in its place, a family not born of blood, not built from plans, but chosen, day after day. And as the night deepened and the house settled into peaceful rest, one truth stood clear and unshakable. They had not found perfection. They had found each other, and that was more than enough. Sometimes miracles don't come as thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, as a stranger who stops when the world keeps walking, as a door that opens when every other door has closed, as love that appears after you are certain you have nothing left to give. God does not always answer prayers the way we expect, but He answers them in the way we need. A woman who believed her life was over was not given a child of her own, but she was given a family who needed her heart. A man who thought he had failed as a father was not given instructions. He was given someone who reminded him how to love. And 4 children who lost their mother were not left alone. They were held, chosen, and protected again. This is how God often works. Not by erasing our pain, but by transforming it into purpose. So, if you are watching this tonight, feeling broken, forgotten, or alone, remember this: your story is not over. What feels like an ending may be the place where God is quietly beginning something new. Look around your life. Sometimes the miracle is not what you lost, but who is standing beside you now. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story made you feel, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories that remind us we are never alone. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your path. May He bring light into your darkest moments, peace into your home, and love into places you thought were empty. And may you always remember, miracles still happen, quietly, gently, every single day.